would like to say a good morning and welcome to all here on this meeting. My name is Gleuto Serafim, and I am the president of the Australian-Brazil Business Council. We are a not-for-profit organization engaged in promoting the strengthening of trade relations between Australia and Brazil, and it is my pleasure to be your host here today. Before we proceed, I would like to mention a few bits of housekeeping. If you can, you will notice that when you come in, you will actually be on mute. If you need to speak, or if you would like to say anything, I would like you to use the chat or raise your hand to actually be unmuted so that we can actually speak. We have three guests here today, and each one of the guests will have a few minutes now a speech, about 10 minutes. Then we'll proceed to a moderated panel, and we would like to thank the participants on that. Now Q&A will be allowed at the end of the session after we have the speakers speaking. We'll be able to open the sessions for questions. While we actually do the best to attend all the questions, I would like to highlight and make a disclaimer that we may not be able to answer all the questions within this 1 hour session that we have. But if there are any remaining questions that are not being addressed today, we'll be answering those via email. And we will also be attending to some of the questions perhaps on our next session that we'll have in a few weeks from now. So I would like to welcome to, this is our first B.Talks online that we're actually doing. We usually do those events now in person, but we are learning to do different things as we are learning to live with remote procedures and working remotely from everywhere else. And today, the topic is not going to be any different than trying to understand and learn a little bit more about COVID-19 and its impact on the bilateral relationship between Australia and Brazil. This event is also the occasion for us to launch the celebrations of 75 years anniversary of the diplomatic relations between Australia and Brazil. So we will discuss more about the accomplishment of this relationship during this event today. So it is my honor to introduce our guest speakers today. We have His Excellency Ambassador of Brazil, Sergio Moreira Lima, that is on the screen there. We have His Excellency General Consul of Australia in Brazil and Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner, Mr. Greg Wallis from Sao Paulo. And we have the Department of Foreign Trade, First Assistant Secretary, Mr. Dougal McInnes. So on behalf of the Australian-Brazil Business Council, I would like to thank you all for participating and for the generous contribution from our supporters. With special thanks to Austrade, to the Department of Foreign Affairs, to the Consulate General of Brazil in Sydney, the Embassy of Brazil in Canberra, and LATAM Airlines. We would like to express our appreciation to all our members, our board directors, and volunteers from the Council as well. The Council wouldn't be possible to exist without the support of many of you generous people. So talk to our team if you would like to become a member, if you're not a member of the Council, and this is perhaps a very good time for us to work together. It is a time of a lot of distress across the globe at the moment with all the things that are happening. And for us as entrepreneurs and business people, there is always a concern to understand how is this going to affect the relations and the trade relations between Brazil and Australia as we do a lot of business in those two countries. And basically, I believe that there are so much that we can learn and collaborate together between our two nations. And I believe that this will be one of the topics that we'll be discussing today. So I would like to thank you very much for your attention. And without any further delay, I would like to introduce our ambassador of Brazil, Mr. Sergio Moreira Lima, to have the words to address the audience today.
Good morning, Australia. Good morning, Brazil. Members of the Business Council. First of all, I congratulate the Australia Business Council for organizing this series of debates on the relations between Brazil and Australia. Gleuto Serafim and his dedicated team, Carol and Flavia, deserve our praise for the conception of the project and the organization of this inaugural debate. I wish to warmly greet my colleagues, my Australian colleagues, the Consul General and Senior Commissioner Greg Wallis in São Paulo, and the First Assistant Secretary Dougal McInnes here in Canberra. As Gleuto mentioned, we are celebrating this year the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Brazil and Australia. The participation of Brazil in the Second World War and the fact that both countries were founding members of the United Nations constitute important elements of convergence, which led to the establishment of diplomatic relations in 1945. Much has been done in the last 7 decades, and prospects for the future are bright. Australia is an important partner of Brazil in the Asia-Pacific region, and we are the two largest countries in the Southern Hemisphere with a tradition in cooperation that dates back the late 18th century. As the largest democracies in Oceania and in Latin America, Australia and Brazil share common values. In foreign affairs, Australia and Brazil are recognized for the contribution to a rules-based international order. Allow me to recollect a remarkable fact, not widely known. At the onset of the Second World War, in the Atlantic Charter in 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill recognized the merit of a principle of legal equality, which Brazil had reclaimed in 1907 during the Hague Peace Conference. The principle of sovereign equality of states is a landmark in the UN Charter and the basis for multilateralism. Nowadays, as members of the G20, Brazil and Australia share common interests as well as growing responsibilities. In 2012, both countries established a strategic partnership. Nowadays, Brazilian companies and Brazilian communities in every state of this huge country are contributing to the development and well-being of Australia. More than 50,000 Brazilians live in Australia, and 27,000 Brazilian students represent the 5th largest contingent of foreign students in Australia. More than 50,000 Brazilian tourists come to Australia every year. And last year, in 2019, Brazil exempted Australian tourists from visa requirements. Brazil has also become the most important market in Latin America for Australian products, and over 80 Aussie companies are in Brazil. During the bushfires, Brazil expressed its solidarity to Australia and offered to send a special forest brigade, fire brigade. Individual Brazilians and NGOs created here by Brazilians helped to assist with volunteer work, communities and farms affected by the bushfires. As you know, Brazil is an important producer of airplanes. Last year, Embraer celebrated 40 years in the Australian market. The Brazilian company has recently developed the KC-390 Millennium, a multi-purpose military aircraft conceived to replace Hercules carriers and also being used to combat forest fires. As we have done in 2019 in Brisbane and Sydney with Embraer's most recent commercial aircraft, we are planning to bring the Millennium to Australia for demonstration flights in 2021. Brazil is the third largest producer of commercial airplanes. Commuting from Sydney to Canberra and between other Australian cities could enormously benefit from the presence of Embraer medium-sized jet flights. Last year, Brazil established an intelligence attaché office in Canberra. And this year, we opened in January a defense attaché office in the Brazilian embassy. The possibility of defense and airspace collaboration could significantly widen the scope of Brazil-Australia bilateral relations. Although geographic distance should not be a factor in our strategic partnership, a direct flight connecting the two countries is needed. We have to keep it in our plans because it will give a new dimension to bilateral trade in goods and services and promote the necessary mutual awareness. But right now, as Gleuto mentioned, we are all suffering the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic. We believe this can represent an opportunity also for enhancing bilateral cooperation in important areas such as health services, scientific research, and biosecurity. As I was mentioned in our conversation before the beginning of the session, Australia has a modern and broad biosecurity legislation, which is helping its authorities to face the pandemic with success. Brazilian and Australian institutions are doing their best to research a vaccine to eliminate the virus while they develop the sound treatment to save lives. The universities of Queensland and Melbourne have already a tradition in contributing to solve, together with Fiocruz and the universities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, epidemics such as dengue, Zika, and chikungunya. The spread of the coronavirus since last December changed the social and economic realities of the modern world. No country is being spared. States have locked down cities to curb contagion. The degree of uncertainty is enormous because of the dimension of the health as well as the economic impact. Yet, this period in isolation has its positive side. And as we reflect upon the lessons we should take away from this experience. In the meantime, we are solving problems of Brazilians affected by the impact of the COVID-19, and also by the measures that are taken by the Australian authorities to face the pandemic, and we have to act accordingly. We are particularly concerned with the students. They represent the future of this important relationship. They will be the scientists and the doctors of tomorrow. They are the ones that will keep the connections with Australia ever stronger. We have to take care of them. One of the consequences of the pandemic is that countries like Brazil and Australia are concentrating upon enhancing their research and capabilities in science and technology. The agreement on science, technology, and innovation signed in 2017 is signed by Australia and Brazil, is in its last stage of approval in the Brazilian Congress. It will become an important instrument to promote joint initiatives. The Memorandum of Understanding between Embrapa and SCIRO, signed in 2019, can also be the basis for studies related not only to face pandemics, but also to promote green technology. Within the G20, Canberra and Brasilia are supporting the so-called coronavirus global response, a strategy which aims at coordinating efforts to correctly respond to the pandemic, its threat to the health and the well-being of people and countries, as well as to address its impact on the economy. Taking into account the magnitude of the crisis generated by COVID-19, negative impacts are expected with the reduction of the number of Brazilian students in Australian universities and education institutions. We hope this will be temporary. The recent challenge of repatriation with a charter flight from Sydney to Santiago and finally São Paulo has shown how important the existence of a direct flight Australia-Brazil would have been. The difference that such a direct flight would make. Most difficulties we had to overcome in that process were related to the connection in third countries and how such interruption affected the overall planning. As I have mentioned before, we should keep our efforts to persuade the airlines to establish that service. And the Business Council is very important for that. On the other hand, the COVID-19 pandemic is making us realize how important global food security has become and how important Brazil and Australia are in the fields of agriculture and biosecurity. The same is also true in relation to energy and the environment. The same would also apply to mining. I would like to give a last word on Brazil and Australia coordination in multilateral fora. There are opportunities emerging for Brazil and Australia cooperating with international organizations. The COVID-19 pandemic is a global challenge, and despite national efforts, implies a need for broader international cooperation. The coordinated action between Brazil and Australia should also seek to combat the pandemic, as well as contribute to strengthen the rules of international trade in order to ensure a sustainable recovery of the world economic activity. Free trade is necessary, and the rules-based international trading system is key to preserve it. We should avoid protectionist tendencies, which would harm competition and innovation. Our economies can overcome the pandemic and emerge stronger if due consideration is given to enhance productivity. The Group of Cairns is an example of convergence and partnership between Australia and Brazil to face protectionism and subsidies and making agricultural trade a level playing field. The answer to COVID-19 should not be protectionism, trade restrictions, export controls, but free trade, international investments, and wider cooperation within the community of nations and the rules-based international order. We fully coincide with Australia, and our coordination within WTO has been remarkable. I wish to conclude by conveying a strong message of confidence in the prospects of bilateral relations based on science and technology, trade and investment, educational exchange, and stronger and fast connections between Brazil and Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for your nice words. I'm sure that the vision is for us to explore a greater bond between uh, Brazil and Australia, and the Council has been very privileged to be acting as an advisory board, I would say, to both the private sector as well as the government in during this last few years. And our relationship with DFAT Australia, the Ministry of Agriculture, the CSIRO, and other agencies of the Australian government are extremely valuable to us. And working together with Embrapa, MDIC, COMEX, SECOM, FIESP, FIERG, and other Brazilian government agencies have also allowed us to grow immensely. And I want to thank the Embassy of Brazil for being receptive of our ideas and sharing with us now the government plans as well as we actually move forward. Without taking too much of the time, I would like to introduce the General Consul in Sao Paulo and Australia Senior Trade and Investment Commissioner, Greg Wallis, and we open the floor for you.
Thank you, Gleuto. You hear me okay, everybody?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. Good morning, everyone, and a good evening, actually, from a wet Sao Paulo here. Probably like the ambassador, I've been spending a lot of time recently, or quite a bit of time, helping Australians get back that want to leave Brazil to get back to Australia. So it's nice to be able to talk about something else tonight, which is my other hat, which is the business side of what I'm doing. So I'd like to talk a bit about the business relationship, and particularly from my point of view, what's happening with that relationship at this stage of COVID-19. I've lived in Brazil for about 10 years, on and off for the past 20 years. And I can tell you that Brazil has overcome some pretty big crises in the past, including the deep recession that we had here between 2015-16. Now, COVID-19, I think everyone would agree, probably presents an even bigger challenge than what that recession did. But the point is, Brazil did overcome that crisis before, and I think will overcome the crisis again with COVID-19. And even when you have crises, of course, there are opportunities. There are opportunities within crises, and I'd like to talk about 3 or 4 of those briefly today as I see them as to what they'll be for Australia. And when you think about those opportunities and you think about Brazil, the thing that you need to remember with this country and its relationship with Australia is the scale of the place. It's the 9th largest economy with more than 200 million people, and it's a significant economic partner for Australia. More than half of all of Australia's exports that go to Latin America go to Brazil, and more than half of all the investment that exists in Latin America from Australia goes into Brazil, I should say. More than half of the investment into Latin America goes into Brazil. And when you think about the fact that people generally think about the very big investments that Australia has in the mining industry in Peru and Chile, it's sobering to think that there's much bigger investments in Brazil, because it's a much broader range of investments that Australian companies are invested in. We have here investments in the agricultural sector, in the resources sector as well, but also in the IT sector and the education sector, retail sales, clothing, lots of different areas of business activity from Australian companies here in Brazil. So the four areas that I want to talk about, the first one is agribusiness, as the ambassador mentioned. And we are rightly proud. We are very proud of our agribusiness sector in Australia, because it's a very innovative, efficient, high quality industry. But when it comes to scale, Brazil is in another league, because agribusiness here represents about 22% of the GDP of the country. In Australia, that figure is 2 or 3%. The beef herd in Brazil, the beef cattle herd in Brazil, is 8 times that of the beef herd in Australia. And the beef industry in Australia is one of the most successful export industries that we have. But when it comes to scale, it can't compete with Brazil. And another example is the sugarcane industry. We have an important sugarcane industry in Brazil, in Australia. In Brazil, the area under cultivation for sugarcane is about 20 times the size of the sugarcane cultivation area in Australia. So the point of all that is to say that agriculture is a very, very important industry in Brazil, and it offers a great deal of opportunity for Australia. And it's also important to point out that contrary to a lot of popular perceptions, we generally don't compete on global agricultural markets. We do to some extent on sugar because it's a commodity, and we do to some extent on beef because Brazil is also a very big beef exporter like Australia, but the markets tend to be geographically different or price point different. So mostly our agricultural trade is not competitive. And the interesting thing about agriculture in Brazil is that, like the recession a few years ago, agriculture is still very, very strong right now in Brazil. In fact, last month, in March of 2020, was the biggest ever month for soybean exports from Brazil. So one sector that is certainly holding up very, very well at the moment, and probably will continue to do so, is the agribusiness sector. And the size of that sector, as I said, presents a lot of opportunity for Australian companies. We have opportunities in inputs to crop production, so things like pesticides, fertilizers, herbicides. Australia has always supplied quite a bit of animal genetics to Brazil, so beef, cattle, dairy cattle, goats, sheep, genetics. And an area that's very exciting and is attracting a fair bit of attention is ag tech. So ag tech in Brazil is already a very big and quite mature industry and very sophisticated. There's about 1,000 companies in this sector in Brazil, and they very much welcome foreign players, particularly foreign players, of course, that can bring efficiencies, that solve problems, that increase the yields of products, and even more so when those companies are focused on the sorts of things that obviously Brazilian agriculture is looking for. So that could be cattle, for example, or it could be crop production. And they're two things, of course, that Australia does very well as well. So both here in the state of São Paulo, we have a very important hub in the city of Piracicaba. There's another very important hub which is opened in the state of Mato Grosso in Cuiabá, and there's some others around the country. And Australian companies are very welcome to participate in those agricultural hubs. And we'd be happy as Austrade to make introductions to those companies to help them do that. There's also a very interesting market, I think, in Brazil for Australian processed and packaged food. This is something that has always been supplied in small amounts with a few companies, but again, it's that issue about the scale of the market here and the size of the middle class, which is more than 150 million people. And it's interesting to note that it's very true that for an Australian company looking to export any products, but take this example of processed packaged food, they would probably look to Asia first. And if they're looking to Latin America, they would probably look to Chile or Peru, from the point of view that those markets have easier access at the moment because we have free trade agreements. So it's not a market that's for everybody, but the point again is that scale. Both Peru and Chile represent a market of about 1/10 the size of Brazil. So while it might be easy to access those markets, if a company has a global vision to be a dominant player in their specific subsector within processed and packaged food, they should be looking at Brazil. And I'll very briefly mention the fact that there's also one thing that I've been very passionate about and working on over the last few years is looking at the opportunity for Brazilian investment into Australian agriculture, particularly, or across all sectors, but the sector that's very interesting is agriculture. And we are helping 2 companies to establish offices in Australia at the moment, to set up offices there, to create jobs in Australia, to build product in Australia. And I think that that's something that there's a tremendous opportunity to grow even further over the next few years. The second sector I'll briefly mention is, and the ambassador also mentioned this, is health and medical technology. Again, because there's a very big market here and quite a sophisticated market in Brazil, particularly when you're talking about the private health system. And in the public sector, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But an important development is that the Brazilian government has recently authorized the use of telemedicine practices in Brazil, which will open up that market to a lot of what we call digital health opportunities. So anything that involves remote record management, real-time patient monitoring, service to rural areas, things at which Australia already has a lot of expertise, will become bigger opportunities in Brazil, as will the opportunities to supply more medical devices here. there's a big industry in Brazil, but there's also a lot of imported equipment, and Australia has a lot of world-leading medical technology, medical devices. Now, of course, in the short term, Brazil's resources are all going to be dedicated towards fighting COVID-19. But in the medium to long term, the health and medical technology area is very, very interesting, and I think a great opportunity for Australian companies. The third one I'll briefly mention is the resources sector. Now, of course, the iron ore industry in Brazil, a lot of people probably know, has suffered some big setbacks with some terrible accidents over the last couple of years. And the oil and gas industry at the moment is in the doldrums. That's certainly true. But in spite of this, or even perhaps because of this, there is still a lot of opportunity for companies that can provide technology solutions in automation to increase yields, to maximize the use of technology and deliver safety. And we've seen over the last little while several companies in that field, the field we call METS, Mining, Engineering, Technology and Services, from Australia to have another look at Brazil. This is a sector that was quite interesting to them a number of years ago. I think the moment will come again fairly soon where this sector is relevant for Australian companies. And the last one I'll mention very briefly is education, as the Ambassador again has also mentioned. I don't need to talk about that a lot because I think people are quite aware of the importance of education of students, and not just students, but the greater relationship between institutions, the research that's done between Australia and Brazil, particularly in a time like this where we're looking to cooperate on a number of very important fields, both in agricultural technology and medical technology. So that will continue to be a very important sector for us, and it's suffering at the moment because of COVID-19, but it certainly will bounce back. And it's interesting that we are here at Austrade in Sao Paulo. We are currently working with 9 or 10 Australian companies that are looking to do business and enter the market here in Brazil. So whilst COVID-19 has thrown up some almost unimaginable challenges to doing business, the fact is that there are still opportunity in some sectors. They're not the only ones, but they're 4 that I wanted to point out. But we think that there will still be an ongoing opportunity for Australian companies here. And the point again is that you have a very big market, you have a lot of challenges, but if you have a global vision to be a leader in a number of fields, then really Brazil is a place that you continue to want to look at. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for your words in there, and I find it very interesting that the 3 major topics in there: agriculture, health, education, it keeps always coming as it's one of the biggest points between Australia and Brazil. We do have some questions now later on that has already kind of popped up in some of those topics that perhaps we'll discuss that as soon as we open the forum for the panel. Without further ado, I would like to welcome again and open the panel at the moment for Mr. Dougal McInnes, who is working for the Department of Foreign Trade in Canberra. He is the DFAT First Assistant Secretary. So with you, Dougal, I would like to open the floor for you.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'd just like to quickly start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which we meet in Canberra, the Ngunnawal people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I'd like to thank the Australia Business Council and indeed the Embassy here in Brazil for this debate, this discussion, and inviting me to take part. I'd also like to thank the Government of Brazil and the MFA and the Ambassador and his team in Canberra for their assistance during the acute consular phase of the COVID crisis, for helping Australians disembark from cruise line ships in Rio, namely Ocean Insignia and the Silver Shadow, for the work we did together on ensuring Brazilians could return home from Australia, and also for the good work in ensuring Brazilians could also take advantage of commercial flights that Australia facilitated. And I think some 400 Brazilians were able to get home to Santiago on those flights and then on to Sao Paulo. So as you've heard, it's from the Ambassador, 2020 marks 75 years of the diplomatic relations between Australia and Brazil. But what we're going through now in this pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis is indeed without precedent over the last 75 years. And there is still a lot of uncertainty about the duration of the pandemic, about the scale of the economic impact, and indeed uncertainty about behaviour change that may well result from the pandemic, both short and medium term. But there are really two certainties, I think, about any crisis. Firstly, it brings to the surface and shows the true colours of a country and its relationship with other countries. And secondly, that we should never waste a crisis in ensuring that we can look to deliver new outcomes and look to do things differently that we never thought possible beforehand. So I'd like to focus in my brief remarks on two aspects of COVID-19. Firstly, how Australia and Brazil are working together during the crisis and the values that shows that we both hold dear. And then secondly, some of the opportunities for the Australia-Brazil relationship in the recovery phase, noting that we're at different speeds of the virus impact and response, and noting that this recovery phase will not be a clearly defined period and will be in a long period of rebuilding and indeed perhaps some second waves of the virus. I also want to acknowledge that whilst we're talking about economic and trade impacts here, this is a public health crisis with hundreds of millions of lives lost. So there's a real human cost. And we need to acknowledge the human scale of that. And indeed, the economic costs that are coming will also have further consequences on societies. So the trade and economic impacts, they have been immediate and massive. And these impacts have really been unprecedented, been driven by unprecedented government interventions domestically, which have had global ramifications, including namely through the global travel bans. For Australia, the safety of our population has been foremost in these interventions, including the travel bans. But what we've seen as a result is a huge impact on air freight, on passenger freight, on tourism and those sectors that rely on international travel. What's been important now is to ensure that countries work together to make sure that those domestic interventions remain temporary and do not become permanent. And that's exactly what Australia and Brazil have been working to do. As the Ambassador mentioned, we are working very closely with Brazil in the G20, in the finance ministers meeting, and looking to make very clear our commitment to mitigating the economic impacts of COVID through open trade and investment flows that are really necessary. And really, any closing down of open trade would really just exacerbate the impacts and hobble any opportunity for recovery. We're also working very closely, our foreign ministers together as inaugural members of this Canada-chaired ministerial coordination group on COVID. This is a group that has emerged rather organically through the crisis, but it's very focused with a non-traditional group of countries focusing on some really immediate response issues. Some of those have been PPE supply, have been keeping air bridges open and supporting vulnerable countries and groups. We've been very like-minded with Brazil in that group, and indeed with Brazil we signed a joint statement on 17 April about keeping essential global links open. So I think that they are good examples of the values and the efforts that Australia and Brazil have taken through the crisis and shown that we're very apt at working well together, not just through the consulate, but through the G20 and this coordination mechanism. I think looking forward to the rebuilding recovery phase, there's a number of areas that we should continue to work on and build momentum. Firstly, we are finalising a bilateral work and holiday MOU, which will, I think, be a real boon for young people to travel and work. The numbers are well known about visitors to Australia and likewise the other way from Brazil, and the 30,000 resident population in Australia that was born in Brazil. And I think we need to nurture these numbers and grow these numbers. This MOU can help do that. Secondly, we have been in advanced stages of a special visitor program, government-sponsored program for the State Secretary of São Paulo to visit Australia. That's obviously on hold, but we're very keen to have that visit restart as soon as possible when travel bans are lifted. and really continued high level access between our two countries is so very important during good times, because they really come to the fore during periods of crisis, as has been shown in the immediate period now, and it helps build resilience in the relationship. I think one of the third areas, and it's been mentioned already, is CSIRO and the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation working together, certainly working on mutual areas of benefit, science, technology, innovation, and Greg's mentioned some of the important and exciting work in agribusiness in that space. I think the WTO and our work with Brazil in that forum, which is really a critical area of trade liberalisation, we're working with Brazil and others in having agreed to an interim appeal arbitration arrangement in the WTO, and that's really to help get around the problem we have of the appellate body being in a state of dysfunction. And it's a really clear example of Australia and Brazil coming together with others to build some innovative solutions to get around some barriers. I think also in the WTO, we're working as key members of the CANS group, an interest group of 20 agricultural exporting companies, and indeed supply chains in agriculture and food security will be critical. So I think the CANS group has a lot of important work to play going forward in the COVID recovery phase. I think the other area in the WTO that's very important that we need to continue focusing on, and that Brazil and Australia have been working well, is in negotiations on fisheries subsidies, on e-commerce negotiations, and on domestic service regulations. And these are all really critical elements of a multilateral trading system that we're working hand in glove in. I think another area that Australia is really taking a leadership role, and it'd be useful to see what work we can do together with Brazil, is in the implications of the COVID crisis on women and girls. We know that globally women perform 72% of unpaid work, and they comprise 70% of healthcare workers. And so really working with that group to understand the impacts and mitigate some of those problems. And unfortunately, we've seen an increase in domestic violence globally since the outbreak. So Australia has a lot of domestic efforts in that space, but we're certainly keen to work more multilaterally with countries, including Brazil, when we did support an 8 April UN statement on COVID and gender-based violence. I won't go through the key sectors because Greg has done that in a very great way, a very detailed way, except to mention two areas that I think bear emphasis, and they are in the airline industry, non-stop flights, and given this disruption and upheaval in that sector, seeing what opportunities may come for Australia and Brazil in setting up a non-stop air route. And then secondly, and by far by no means least, in the area of international education, and seeing, given the current difficulties, how we can build that sector, which is crucial to our bilateral relationship. So as I noted in my opening to these remarks, the 75-year anniversary is a really important point, and indeed a moment during the crisis to reflect on what we can do better and how we can drive forward the relationship to a stronger point. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mr. McInnes, for your words in there, and we really appreciate now the welcome that the Australian government and the nation in itself has done as a great reception for the Brazilians throughout the years in here. I've been a Brazilian national, and I have been in Australia for over 30 years. It is amazing to see now this welcome that Australians have, and the love that they have for the Brazilian people here, and we will continue to portray a good representation of Brazilian nationals here in Australia, and we would like to continue to work together. I am sure that there are a lot more that we can probably do, and as part of these 75 years of diplomatic relations, and I find that most of the questions that I actually had in here today have actually been answered now throughout the presentation of the three of you there. But it's one of the first questions that I actually had, and you guys have covered quite a bit on that. But I will still bring it up because It's about the 75 years of diplomatic relations in Australia and Brazil are celebrating now. I'll call it a good celebration. Perhaps just to recover that, what are the achievements and prospects that we believe that we have actually got throughout these 75 years, and maybe perhaps just are there any things on the pipeline now as part of these 75 years that that we actually planning to do more in the imminent future, especially with the COVID now 19. Is there anything else that we could probably summarize? And I would probably put that to Greg and you, Mr. McInnes, and then perhaps the ambassador of Brazil probably has his perspective as well. In a short term in there, are there in your minds any achievements and prospects that that we could probably tie up with the 75 years?
So would you like me to go first before Greg? Yeah. Sure. I mean, I think that the numbers are really a key part of the success to date, and then the numbers of visitors to Australia and visitors to Brazil, and really building on that. I think the numbers of Brazilian students in Australia, around 25,000, we need to build on. And even the numbers of Australian companies, I think around 80 Australian companies in Brazil, 1/4 of which are listed on the ASX 200. So building on those numbers, I think going forward. I think the other area for us is really one of implementation and delivery on some of the MOUs that we have between Australia and Brazil, on sporting events, on air services, on water, on science, tech, and innovation. So I think they're all really areas that we should look to focus on as we look to both celebrate and build on the 75-year anniversary. I'll hand over to Greg.
Yeah, Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Gleuto, and thank you for the question. My very brief answer is not so much related to the 75 years, although that's a very important milestone. But just to build on what Dougal just said, I think it's not well recognised the importance of the commercial relationship between Brazil and Australia. As I said, by far the most important trading partner in Latin America, and particularly because we have seen in recent years, particularly with the JBS investment in Australia, which is a very big investment in a sector that's very important and productive sector in Australia, employs thousands and thousands of Australians. I think there's an opportunity for an increased level of bilateral investment, and even more so than trade, when you start to see more and bigger companies from Australia come to Brazil and Brazil go to Australia, then we'll see an even bigger, let's say, visibility amongst the public of the relationship between Australia and Brazil. There's not many people would have much of a notion of the Australian companies that are here, and vice versa. We had a meeting with the then mayor of São Paulo, who's now the governor, João Doria, about 18 months ago, and I took into that meeting 12 of the CEOs of the biggest Australian companies that were in São Paulo, and he and his team were absolutely amazed because they had no idea of the Australian business presence in Brazil, and particularly that presence in São Paulo. So that's just an indication. There's a lot more we can do on the publicity side, but there's also just so much more that we can do to build that presence of companies in each country that's going to elevate that relationship.
Well, thank you, Greg. This is good. It's good to hear, and we have been close to a number of the companies that are represented on both countries. In there, the council is involved. I believe we have about 200 companies, about 100 Australian companies in Brazil, and about 100 Brazilian companies in here. So it's been a great representation. Maybe we could close this question with Ambassador Sergio, adding to it, on the 75 years. What are the achievements and the prospects that you believe that we are now aiming for this year?
Thank you, Gleuto. I think that on a broad and historic perspective, I think that the contribution of Brazil and Australia for a rules-based international order, after the fact that the two countries fought in the First and Second World Wars. Brazil was the only country that fought in the Second World War, the only Latin American country that participated, and the participation of Brazil in that milestone, that is very important because it defined the perspectives of the world at that moment. And the fact that both countries were founding members of the United Nations is very telling. Because you have established the values and the foundations for the future. And this was very in accordance with Brazilian traditions, because Brazil, even before Brazil was born in 1822, the commitments of Brazilians when Brazil was a colony of Portugal were in the defense of a rules-based international order, and with the and the defense of diplomacy and the solutions through diplomacy instead of the use of force. So the history of Brazil created with its diplomacy the stability within Latin America and within South America in particular, as it negotiated its border based on principles that Brazilians helped to create, bringing from international private law. So all these important traditions Brazil brought into the world, and it helped. And many of the principles that are in the United Nations Charter, Brazil has a finger on them. So I think that we are talking about countries that had put their imprints in the order that we have today, and they have an interest in preserving this order because they fought for it. In relation to today, I would say that I would repeat here the message that I received in my first meeting with the Australian authorities. They came to me and they told me, Brazil, Ambassador, you should be proud because the Brazilian community here, the Brazilians, are helping the development of Australia. So I think this is the consequence of 75 years of a relationship, is when a country contributes to the development of the others. Not only because of the community of the Brazilians that are here, that are working, that have studied, and they are giving a contribution to the well-being of the people, but because the perspectives that these are opening through this strategic partnership and through the students who are part of this strategic partnership. And that's why we are concerned of the well-being of these students, because as I said before, they represent the future. But I would add a final point, which is defense. Brazil, we have an important submarine policy, and our university have been forming, preparing in this area of submarines and defense already for many years. And this is an important area for the future. Brazil can contribute to the current efforts of Australia in this regard. And as I mentioned, biosecurity. Australia have developed a robust legislation on biosecurity that I believe it should be an inspiration for Brazil in the future. So I think that Embraer, I think that Embraer is also could have a much stronger position within Australia, helping Australia to make their connections. This is a huge country. And also Embraer should be here. Embraer was here until, some 5-6 years ago. But it should, and then it moved to Singapore. I think Embraer should be here in Australia. It should come back to Australia and stay here because this is a very important market. And the presence of Embraer here can make a difference. It celebrates 40 years, but it must return to Australia. And I think now with the KC-390 and the capabilities of this plane also for emergencies and for, it will be very useful for the Pacific. It will be not only useful for Australia, but it will be useful for the Pacific. So I would, I'm doing my best to raise profile of Embraer here in Australia.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm sure that you have. I've seen some of the documents and some of the conversations that we had at the embassy there in relation to Embraer representing here in Australia. And I think it's a great point. Well, thank you all three for answering that question. We have quite a few questions actually coming up in here. We only have another 5 minutes now for this session, but because this session was focused on the COVID-19 pandemic, I had a question in here. Is that I heard about CSIRO and BRAPA and some of the other elements that have been part of some signatures and some work that has been done together. But can any of you tell the audience that we have here today what are some of the direct cooperation that on the COVID-19 pandemic that is happening between Brazil and Australia at this present moment? Are you aware of any research universities or any direct pharmaceutical companies that are working together at the moment, or is there something that we need to do to improve that? And I'm not sure if any of you, I know that I'm putting you guys on the spot in here on this question, because that is one of the questions that actually came up, and I don't have the answer, but I'm not sure if the government is aware of any work directly with COVID-19 resolutions that is happening between Brazil and Australia at this present moment.
I don't know.
I guess that is okay. We'll move on to the next question then. One of the questions that actually was made in here, I think, was for the question is about for Greg Wallis and DFAT. Any estimate dates of when Australia will open its border for students who are in Brazil and their visas are running out and they are stranded there? At the moment, is there any perspective from the government to allow those students back in Australia?
I could have a go at answering that, Gleuto. So the question was about Brazilian students who are in Brazil looking to go to study in Australia. Is that right?
Correct. And some of the Brazilians that actually have gone back to Brazil during the crisis, but now they need to have the borders open again.
Right. Well, I can say that that the borders will be open are not open at the moment, of course, and may not be for quite some time yet. I think it's been made quite clear by the Prime Minister and others in government that the Australian borders for international travel will not open for a significant amount of time, and that it may be towards the end of this year or maybe even into the new year. So Brazilian students are not any different in that regard, that they would not be considered separate from the opportunity for other people to travel to Australia. So unfortunately, it's not likely that that the students will be able to return to Australia to study in the short term. The other question, of course, is a question about whether or what will be done about the visas that they have applied for and that they may have already obtained. And that's an issue that I understand is still being considered by the Minister to make a determination as to what ruling he will give on those students. Would you like to add anything to that, Dougal?
Yeah, I think that's good points, Greg. I just add 1 or 2 points. One, I know that the government has been working with universities to offer a range of support to students that are either outside of the country or cannot continue their studies, and that includes fee deferrals, deferred payments or just deferred studies, and looking to help as much as they can given the circumstances. So there's a lot of work going on there. I should also note there's a huge amount of work going on here domestically to help students given the difficulties at the moment. Including looking at allowing students that have been here for over a year to access superannuation and ensure that students can continue to work 40 hours a week. Just on that earlier question around what Australia and Brazil are doing right now in the crisis, I mean, from a commercial sense, I was struck that obviously we have an Australian company, McInnes, who launched in Brazil last year, which is working in the health and medical space, and is obviously the second largest influenza vaccine company in the world. So there's a huge existing work there that we can build on in the health and medical space. Thanks.
Okay, while you were actually speaking, there were quite a few probably questions that came across in relation to the students, and especially the students that are here. And I think, Mr. McInnes, Dougal, you actually have answered some of those questions in there. But one of the issues that have been highlighted, and the council has actually been receiving quite a few calls in relation to helping and assisting some of the students that are currently here. They are mid-course at the moment. They haven't been able to go back to Brazil, and now as the COVID extension has drama has actually extended, and some of them have actually lost the daily jobs that they used to do, because most of those services are actually stopped. And the question has been on for those students that have been struggling in here. The government has not offered a financial aid or flexibility for those students. And is that anything that that it is on the being discussed in government? And is there any way that that the government can actually respond to that inquiry that is coming from a lot of the students that are here? I'm not talking about the students that have gone back to Brazil, but the ones that actually are here mid-course at the moment.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And look, it is a really difficult time for students in Australia, international students, and I have a huge amount of sympathy for some of those really difficult circumstances. The government has been working closely with the universities. They have recognised that some students can receive support from families and networks while they're in Australia. For those where that's not possible, the government has provided $200 million to reputable charities to help support students, including a specific allocation of $7 million to the Red Cross to help students across, and a range of people across the community. They've also looked at ongoing access to mental health and welfare services, and the universities themselves have put in place, alongside state and territory governments, a range of services to support those students.
Okay, well, thank you for that answer in there. I don't know if Greg or Sergio would like to add to that, but I can move on to the next question. We are just we're running out of time very soon, but what I would like to perhaps just highlight in here is that there is a question that I found that quite interesting in here that's coming from Leonardo Ribeiro. What are the most significant challenges that Brazil and Australia need to work together to improve bilateral businesses versus the economy growth? And that is, we have an audience in here of a lot of business people, a lot of company owners and directors that are watching this. And what can we do to actually know what are the things in there? And I'll put this on the floor. What are the challenges that we can actually aid and help? Maybe we can start with Ambassador.
Yes. Thank you, Gleuto, for the question. I think it's a very good question, and I would start by saying that in terms of challenge, what would enhance our competitiveness would be a free trade that would put us in equal footing and establish a level playing field for our companies and the Australian company too, and Brazil is a big market, so everything would justify this. But we are part of Mercosur, and this would have to be done according to the current rules in terms of negotiation with the Mercosur. I think that this is important to establish free trade agreement that would involve Brazil and Australia is a must, because otherwise our companies and our business will be competing from a position that is not. We have to overcome this and create and facilitate to establish a good basis for the private sector to operate. And I think that a free trade agreement would be an answer to this biggest challenge of putting trade and investment into a new level.
Okay.
I would add a comment if I can, Gleuto. It's the commercial relationship it's something that if you look at the big picture, it's very difficult to change the history, the culture, the distance, all those big factors that are part of the reason for the level of commercial engagement. You can't change those things overnight. They change over a long period of time. But I think there's two things that can change. There's two opportunities that can change. One is that Australian companies can recognise that Brazil is an important market of diversification, and that probably is more so true today than it's ever been. That where else in the world are you going to find a very big market that, from the point of view of an Australian company, is largely untapped? So it's up to us to promote that opportunity, to demonstrate where those opportunities are, and China and India are not the only games in town, particularly these days. Brazil should be in that group as well. And on the Brazilian side, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in Brazil too, because there's a lot of reform still needs to be done, economic reform, that is going to make Brazil a more competitive environment and make it rise up in those global ease of doing business rankings. It's hard to convince an Australian company to come here if they look at that statistic and see that Brazil is 125 or 116 in the world, and Malaysia is 23 or whatever the numbers are. Those things matter. So there's work to be done on both sides, but we certainly can do it.
Well, thank you for your answer there. And it's quite interesting because one of the questions that we had in here was, considering the high volume of products imported from China and the dependency on China for some products, it is a good timing to other countries offer the products and services to Australia as an option to reduce Australian dependency on China. And Brazil is a big producer of a lot of things. And my question that I would put on top of that is, isn't this a good time due to the crisis that we're actually going to perhaps now come up with an emergency introduction of a free trade agreement for anything that is related to medical supplies and even software and hardware that is produced in Brazil and produced in Australia? One of the questions that we actually had in here was in relation to the National Health Information Agreement and some of the software that is actually available here in Australia. If we're taking that to Brazil, there is a big tax now applied to those solutions in there. And then if we're actually trying to bring some of the medical equipment that is manufactured in Brazil to Australia, they also have a tax involved in that. And perhaps through these crises that we're going through here, wouldn't that be a good time for us to actually start on an attempt for a free trade agreement, even if it's not applicable to every sector, but perhaps to some of the critical ones that we're actually working on? I can leave those ones for the ambassador, the consul general there, and the Austrade for perhaps have a reflection, and maybe you do have an answer that you.
I think on the few points there from my side, if I could. So on the FTA question, obviously Brazil is part of Mercosur and negotiate as a bloc. So we cannot have a bilateral FTA, and we're really focused at the moment on as Greg has really helpfully outlined in his remarks, looking at key sectors that provide opportunity and momentum, and there's a lot of them. So I think focusing on some of those sectors is really important. Australia, as a general rule, does not negotiate FTA on a sector by sector basis. I think on your question about dependency in China, I mean, I wouldn't see, I wouldn't frame it in those terms. I think rather than dependency, we see mutual benefit in our economic relationship with China, and we have had great benefit from the breadth and depth of that trading relationship, which will continue. And indeed, during the crisis, you need to focus on those things that can continue to deliver for trade and economic benefits. But at the same time, we want to work with business to look at new markets and new areas. And I note that in Australia, only 2% of businesses export, which is quite a small amount compared to some other countries. And so we really want to increase that percentage, and working on key sectors with Brazil is part of that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for that, and I read the question verbatim, and that's so I didn't kind of reformulated that. So apologize for that if it came a little bit negative there on the China issue. But I think that there is a desire from a lot of business people in Brazil to be considered now to also be a supplier to Australia, and because we don't have an FTA, or because we don't have certain benefits now, the double tribute that we actually pay, double taxation that we actually have between Brazil and Australia, it becomes sometimes very difficult for us to expand between the two nations. I personally have companies here and I have companies in Brazil, and it's very difficult because I have to make now tax declarations on both sides, and I get taxed on both sides. It's sometimes we look at that and says, wow, we're trying to work together, but it's not actually too much of a benefit for us sometimes. But look, it's a struggling that I believe that every business person actually has, and we have had a lot of time to be at home now and reflecting on how our businesses are actually going across the globe. And instead of actually working less, we are most of us are working more hours because we start early. We don't break for lunch. We go on until 10, 11 o'clock at night every day because we're working from home. But and that has made us reflect a lot on our trade, on our working with government and non-government agencies and so on. The crisis has actually brought a lot of good ideas. We have been talking to a lot of people. The council has been involved with a lot of organizations that have now come up with some very great solutions. Some of them we believe that it's time to put on the table to actually help to share and export those ideas between our two countries. And we would like, I believe that 2 years ago there was an agreement that was actually signed as an MOU for collaboration in innovation and technology. And we are trying to see if where is that going. I think that it was actually in Congress in Brazil to be approved, so that we could actually kind of leverage a little bit more about that exchange of technologies and IP between Australia and Brazil. And definitely, I think the world has been working closer together with this crisis that has been a global crisis. And Brazil is a large player in Latin America, and we believe that that together we are the two largest economies in the Southern Hemisphere. And there is no reason why we should not embrace and collaborate and actually work closer in a lot of those solutions. We will have to probably close this session today, and we will have another session coming up next month. Those who are attending here are welcome to join the council and to become a member, and to come next month for our next webinar. Again, we will have other speakers, and the ambassador will be back with us again in a month's time to contribute a little bit more of the progress that government is actually working. We'll welcome Greg Wallis and Mr. McInnes as well to be with us next month. I would like to thank you for attending this seminar today and for the questions that have been done. And if you do have another question that has not been answered today, I would like you to please send it to us, or put that on your chat now. It will not be answered today, but throughout the week we'll be able to find the answers and actually send them across to you. I would like to close this now with a few words. I will start the other way around now, and I would like now Mr. McInnes to basically say his last words for us to close this session, and then Greg Wallis, and then I'll finish with Ambassador.
Well, thank you. I would just end where I started, which was to thank you and the Council and the Ambassador here for this initiative and for inviting me to take part. There's been a huge amount of bilateral cooperation during the COVID crisis between Australia and Brazil, and it just speaks volumes to the strength and the people-to-people links between Australia and Brazil, and we look forward to building on that momentum despite the current difficulties of the COVID pandemic. So thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. McInnes. Greg.
And also from me, Gleuto, thank you very much to you and the Council, to Carol and Flavia also for helping out tonight. It's a great opportunity. And to the people who are listening who are interested in business and the commercial relationship, please get in touch with you or get in touch with me, and we'll be very happy to help you do business either way. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Ambassador.
Yes, I would like again to thank you very much for this initiative, and to thank very much my colleagues. To tell Dougal that we are very grateful to DFAT, as I had the opportunity to send him a letter, thanking DFAT, the minister, for all the collaboration that we had in the difficult moments, and thank for the dialogue, the fluid dialogue that we have with them in addressing all the questions and our concerns. In terms of the future, again, I think that the size of the two economies, as you rightly said, is very telling. They are, Brazil is one of the 10th largest economies in the world, and Australia is more or less in the same league. And we have the trade that we have and investment that we have, they are significant, but they can be much more. And we have to look at these opportunities. We should not waste time. And the fact that there are two great democracies and two countries that play such an important role in their regions, demand, a look into what we can do in terms of the restrictions and how we would overcome to make the potential of these two great countries to realize for the benefit of their own population. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I would like to let all of you know that this session has been recorded. It will be available on our website if you would like to listen to it again and see the participation. And I would like to ask you to actually put in your diary that every first Thursday of every month, we'll have this session at 8:30 in the morning as our breakfast now session. So thank you very much. I want to thank all the participants today, and it was a great honor to have you here with us, and the Council is here at your service. And I would like to thank Flavia and Carol that have put enormous amount of hours to actually get this together, and the rest of the team at the Australian Brazil Business Council as well. So thank you very much, and I would like to wish all of you a very good day, and for those in Brazil, a very good evening. So thank you.
Thank you, Gleuto. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Carol.
Thank you all. Thank you all.